much for inviting me and to all of you for attending. I hope this will be useful. I'm going to go through the actual presentation quite quickly because there's rather a lot in it, but we want to have a lot of time for discussion, so I expect that during the discussion, if needed, we can go back and cover some things in more detail. My goal here today is to really try to open the curtains from Google's point of view and demystify and provide information to all of you about the scope of the privacy challenges that Google faces, what sorts of things are going on with Google and privacy, and some of the approaches that we have found most fruitful to take. And my hope is that this information will be useful to all of you as you go onward, to reason about these things in future. So in January, on Data Privacy Day, Google released this set of guiding privacy principles. And this was our attempt, after a great deal of internal discussion and back and forth, to have a plain human language expression of how we discuss privacy internally when we are looking at each privacy question that we face within Google and attempting to make sure that we do the right thing. So we boiled this down into these 5 principles, which begin with, number 1, that we should always be using information to provide the best possible products and services for our users. And in practice, what this generally boils down to is saying if we are collecting this information, if we're storing it, if we are retaining it, we should be able to say, this is how this benefits our users. This is what it's for. Secondly, that our aim is to develop innovative products that reflect strong privacy standards and practices. And a critical part of this, especially from the point of view of my team, is that whatever talent for innovation, for outside-the-box thinking, for coming up with new and different technical solutions that Google applies to the entire range of its product line, to everything that we do, we should apply that no less to privacy. We should be attempting to come up with new and creative solutions that really give people what it is that they need and want from privacy. Making the collection of personal information transparent and giving users meaningful choices, I think, are really some of the most critical approaches in our toolbox, and this is something that I will come back to as I go through the rest of the presentation. And then finally, being a responsible steward of the information we hold. I myself come to the problem of privacy out of security, so the things that immediately spring to mind to me for being a responsible steward are very much making sure that there's appropriate protection of all of this data, both in terms of Google's external perimeter, but also in terms of having nuanced access controls inside Google, having proper monitoring to make sure that data is always treated with the respect that it deserves. There are other components of responsible stewardship, of course, and if you asked one of my counterparts from the legal team, they would have, comparable things from the legal side that they would immediately bring up that would spring to mind that are part of that responsible stewardship. There we go. All right. So as many of you, I'm sure, have seen before, Google's corporate mission statement is that we are a company that is set out to organize all of the information in the world and make it useful. And working on privacy for Google, I think it's always been very apparent to me that many of the best things that Google manages to do come directly from this mission statement, but also all of Google's most difficult or most challenging issues around privacy also tend to come directly from this mission statement. And so the way that we tend to want to heal that breach is to see privacy as an inherent part of organizing the world's information so that it will be accessible and useful, because that will not be acceptable to anyone unless privacy is adequately addressed within that organization. So, all right, this is where I begin to jump into a lot more detail. As I go around and speak to people about privacy and grapple with the question of privacy for Google, a theme, a question that consistently comes up is the sense of Google as having so much information, that there's this very broad scope of information, and that what that scope entails may be somewhat confusing. What kinds of information are included in that may be somewhat confusing, and what the implications of that information are, of having that information collected, may be somewhat confusing. So what I am offering to you here is a breakdown of how to begin to think about that entire scope of information that Google holds, because this is very much how I wind up reasoning about it as I work on this internally. I find it useful to think of this whole scope of information that Google has in terms of these three boxes. And I'm going to talk about them quickly, each in turn. I'm going to begin with this box that I've labeled Google account data, in part because that is actually one of the easiest boxes for us to grapple with. This is the box that contains all of the information where I, as a Google user, have created an account with Google, where I have a username and I have a password. I come to Google and I log in, and then I interact with Google services in the context of being logged into that account. So I do this, and I go and I interact with my Gmail, with perhaps my spreadsheets or my documents if I'm using Google Apps, or my photos if I'm using Picasa, all of these things. And this is a fairly straightforward relationship, because it is straightforward for Google to be able, once I am logged in, to show me all of my Gmail and allow me to edit it or delete it or take it out of Google if I want to. It's straightforward for Google to show me my documents, my spreadsheets, my photos. So this is a relatively simple place for us to provide this straightforward transparency and control to users, and we continue to strive to do the best possible job that we can there. I think this is also the kind of data that people are often thinking of first. It's very natural for people to think of data as being about me, but as we address privacy for Google, we have to take that question and say, what meaning of about you are we currently dealing with? So this is a very straightforward meaning. About you means about your account. And your account is you because you have a password and a username and a way to indicate to Google that you are the same you who logged in last time because you have the password. Now let me turn your attention to this box that we have labeled log data, which is a much more challenging box in many ways. Now, this is not only log data. It's really a slightly more general category than that, but log data, search log data, is the example that tends to, I think, immediately spring to everyone's mind. This data, or this box, contains all of the data that is recorded as a result of individual interactions between Google servers and machines in the outside world. So a canonical example would be I, sitting at my machine in the outside world, decide to go to Google to perform a search. So I load up Google's main search page in my own web browser, and I type in a query term, and I hit the search button. And that query goes over the internet from my machine to Google servers, to one of Google servers, which receives that query, collects from inside Google a set of search results to return to me, sends that back over the internet to me. And that action that the server took of receiving that query, compiling the search results and sending them back, is recorded in a log line on the server side. So this box contains all of those records of information came over to a Google server from somewhere, information was sent back. And I'm going to unpack that box in a bunch more detail in the following slides, again, because I think this is the most behind the scenes. This is the one that people often find the most mysterious. And so a lot of my goal here is to make it much less mysterious so that everyone can begin to think about it and reason about it in the way they find the most useful. Finally, the third box, this is the everything else box. So this is all of the information that Google has that does not come from direct interactions. So in this box, we have the interactions in the context of an account where, I am checking my mail, and there are changes in the data as a result of me having read certain mail messages and deleted others, and that comes from this interaction. In the log data box, these are these single sort of transactional interactions. In this box, we have, for example, the search index, which is all of the information collected as Google servers go out and crawl the entire web, so not so interactive. We also have things like Google Maps. This is the actual map data. Google Earth, Google Sky, all these other sources of information that are brought in by Google and put into the pot as we try to organize everything and make it useful. So when grappling with the question of sort of all the data that Google has and what is the scope of this data and what are the implications of that, these three boxes provide good coverage. So I offer that as a way to break it down and begin to think about it more. So now to dive in somewhat more detail into the log data. I think people often find it very helpful to see a very concrete example. So here we have someone who has come to Google to search on flowers, and they've entered the query term flowers, and they have hit the search button, and that query goes over the internet to a Google server, which sends back the search results, as described before. And the server writes a log line that looks like this. My apologies for it getting a little squished together there. So the first thing there, we have the IP address of the machine that connected to the Google server. So this is the user's machine, or perhaps the user's cable modem, or whatever machine is the one where Google actually sees the IP address. The date and the time of the search, the URL including the query, that's how we record the query, the browser type and operating system as reported to Google by the user's browser, and the cookie ID. And the cookie that we're talking about here is an unsecured cookie that for historical reasons is called the Pref cookie, because from the very beginning it was always the cookie that if you went to Google without being logged in, just to the plain search page, and you set some of those preferences, like I want moderate safe search, and my preferred language is Spanish, and I want 15 search results per page, that was the cookie that would store those preferences so that they would be sticky, so that the next time you went to Google they would still be there. So the cookie is a little text file stored on the user's own machine in the context of the user's browser. And if you went into the file system on your own machine and opened the Google Pref cookie, it would look like this. So the name of the cookie is Pref. There's a randomly assigned ID number that is loosely presumed to be unique. It's a loose presumption because this is not a secured cookie, and these cookies do get stolen and cloned and copied. But it's a good enough presumption for Google's purposes. We've got a couple of the encoded preferences, like language display preference equals English is encoded as LB equals N. We have a couple of numbers that are encodings of the dates and times that important things happened to this cookie, primarily when it was created and when it was last modified. We have the domain is google.com. That's what tells the browser that it should only provide this cookie to google.com servers. Send for any type of connection. Again, this is not a secured cookie, so that the browser does not have to require SSL, HTTPS, any kind of encryption before sending it over the internet. And the expiration date. Okay, so now that I have made that log data hopefully a bit more concrete, and people have an idea of what this data is that we're talking about, what's going on with that data? What is Google's interest in that data? How do we use it? How do we hold on to it? What are the implications for users of that use? So I've been working on doing a better and better job of explaining this for about 2 years now. And as a result of that experience of those 2 years, I have distilled this into this slightly gangster movie-like formulation. But I think it works well. Google's fundamental interest in this data is to use it to learn from the good guys. And what I mean by learn from the good guys is to build our systems to learn and respond to all the interactions that Google servers have with actual human beings who are using the system in good faith. Actual human beings who come to Google and enter a search query and hit the search button because they really want to see the most useful search result that Google can return to them for that query, and they will click on the one that they find most useful. That's good faith. The other side of that coin is the need to fight off the bad guys, who are all the people, or sometimes botnets or scripts operating on behalf of people, who are interacting with Google servers not in good faith. They're entering that search query not because they want to see the most useful result that Google can return for that query, but instead because they want to influence the functioning of the systems in some way that will be to their benefit at the expense of everyone else. And I'll go into that in a little more detail in slides that follow. And then finally, I'm also including this third category of inventing the future, because I want to demonstrate for you, or make a little bit more real for you, what Google is thinking of when we say that we feel it's important to preserve this data for innovation. Because innovation is a very easy word to toss around. So I want to make it concrete for you what sorts of things Google means by that. So let me talk briefly about PageRank. When I talk to people about Google and privacy, and I ask people, how do you think Google makes the search engine good? What is your understanding of the science that goes into building a search engine to provide the best possible search results to its users. Many people know about PageRank, right? And many people can somewhat explain PageRank to me. And most of those people think PageRank is still how it works. But the actual truth of the matter is that PageRank should be thought of as the opening move in an ongoing chess game. And I'm going to explain a bit of how that works. But I want to point out about this opening move that from the very beginning, the fundamental insight of PageRank was a learning from the good guy's insight. Because what Larry and Sergey figured out with PageRank when they were working on it at Stanford was that the people who were constructing the web in good faith, the people who were creating web pages and linking from anchor text in one web page out to other web pages, were providing a signal about what they, with their human intelligence, had assessed as being web pages that were useful in the context of that particular anchor text or keyword. And that they could build Google as the search engine to go out, crawl the web, and harvest those signals from humans about which web pages were believed to be good, and pull that back into the functioning of the search engine to provide the most useful search results possible for everyone. So that was the opening move of the chess game. Immediately, the answering move happened. So this was the bad guys showed up, because there's a strong economic incentive to having your web page return high in search results, even if it's not a useful page for users. And so the bad guys immediately began to try to mimic good guys to Google search algorithms, which of course don't in themselves have human intelligence, and could be fooled by bad guys constructing web pages with many, many, many links. And so we began to see link farms as a problem. We began to see web spam as a problem. And I think a lot of us experienced this as, for example, going and searching on travel and not being able to get useful search results because you would have pages and pages of these sort of travel aggregation sites that weren't actually useful. And so this is a very frustrating experience. So we're now, opening move, answering move into this chess game. And Google's engineers and scientists are going, all right, now what do we do to solve this? And so they go back to this insight of learning from the good guys, and they look around to where else this can apply. And where it applies to great effectiveness is the log data. And I'm going to go back to this picture of the log line to walk you through a very toy example of how that works, but I think once we have that example in hand, we can very much see how powerful this is and how it generalizes. So suppose we go back to this person who has searched on flowers, and this log line has been written by the server that processed the search, and the user has received back a set of search results that represented Google's system's best faith estimate of what was likely to be the most useful search result, the second most useful search result, the third most useful search result. And so the person who searched on flowers is now looking at this set of search results and deciding what to do next. And the server that wrote this log line is continuing on to write more log lines into the file as it processes searches for other people. At some point, a few seconds later, the person who searched will decide which one of those search results they think is the most interesting, and they will click on that one. Let's suppose they click on the fifth search result. When they do that, the information that they clicked on the fifth search result will go back to the Google server, which will then write another log line. So this will be somewhere later down in the file, because there have been a bunch of other intervening log lines. And this log line will look very similar to this one. Again, it will be the IP address, be the date and the time, maybe it's 5 seconds later. Instead of the URL including the query, there'll be an encoding of which search result was clicked on. So it'll be this was the result URL, and it was the fifth search result, something like that. And then again, the browser type and the operating system and the cookie ID. So what's important to see here is that for Google and for Google's systems, those two log lines, the original log line from the search and the following log line from the click, separated in the log file by a bunch of other log lines, but linked together by that IP address and cookie pair, are a little story, basically, a little story that Google can learn from. A story of Google systems getting it pretty good but not perfect, because the user clicked on the fifth search result. Perfect would have been the first one. And that story is a little bit of information from a good guy, from someone operating in good faith, that in that context, perhaps at that time of day, in that geographical area, in this language, the fifth search result was perceived as most useful. And perhaps it should be bumped up a little bit. probabilistically for the next searcher who comes along, compared to search results 1 through 4. So this is a very, very simple toy example, but it's an extremely powerful strategy and technique, and it generalizes to much, much more sophisticated learning from stories that may, in some cases, be months long. Let me demonstrate briefly here a little bit to elaborate a little bit more on, how this generalizes and becomes more sophisticated. Spelling correction. We have the example here in Italian, but let's go back to thinking of the person who searched on flowers. Suppose when they first came to Google and they searched on flowers, they mistyped, and they typed flores instead of flowers. If we think about the story that is likely to generate in the log lines, I think you can see that what we're likely to see is a 3 log line story this time, in which in the log lines we're going to have first a log of a search query on flores, which instead of being followed by a click on a result, will be followed by another search query, this time on flowers, because the user will not have liked any of the search results they got for flores, followed by a 3rd log line, which will be the click on a result for flowers. And that 3 log line story, that's a spelling correction story. You get search, search, click. Right? And when that spelling correction story is seen over and over again, a significant number of times, enough times by Google systems, the system can learn that is a spelling correction story and begin to make that inference, that correction automatically for users in order to provide them with a better search experience. So this is another example of how this generalizes. Let me go back to the bad guys for a moment. For every technique like this that Google puts into place in order to learn from the good guys, as a general rule, one can count on the fact that the bad guys will then show up and attempt to do their own version of it. All right? If Google is going to learn which search results are best based on people clicking on them, the bad guys will write botnets to click on particular search results to try to drive them up. Right? If Google is going to learn which ads perform best by looking at which ones get the most clicks, right, then similarly, right, there will be a problem where botnets, evildoers, bad guys will show up and click on ads not because they are interested in potentially buying the product, but because they want to force someone's advertising budget to be used up. They want to benefit financially from this in some way. So in all of these cases where Google is dependent on the system being good guy behavior, there's a corresponding need to be able to detect, to determine for each one of these interactions, do our systems believe that was a human operating in good faith, or do we not? And so when we believe it's a human operating in good faith, we say that was a good click on an ad and we will charge the advertiser for it. Or we say that was a good click on a search result and we will allow it to affect the functioning of the system. When our systems believe that it was not an actual human operating in good faith, we'll say that click goes in the bad bin, we won't charge the advertiser. Or in some cases, there are so many interactions coming in from a particular IP and cookie, that we say this is a denial of service attack and we push a filter. So for all of these things, there's a need to make that decision. This was good faith, this was bad faith. And the way that the system makes those decisions is generally to leverage the fortunate fact that might give us all a little bit of extra faith in human nature, that there will always be many more good guys than bad guys. And so there will always be this large set of information that Google can use to statistically characterize the range of good guy behavior and identify bad guy behavior as falling outside that range because it is too regular, it is too predictable, it is in some way not the way people behave when they are operating in good faith. So what I hope this has done is to give you a concrete feeling of insight into what Google's relationship to this data is, what this fundamental use is. I think for many people it is very immediately natural to spring to thinking of all of this data as being about particular people. But I think you can see that in what I have described here, there is nothing in the process of learning from these stories that involves knowing who that was on the other side of that IP and that cookie. The important thing is not who was it. The important thing is, was it a good guy or a bad guy? And what can we learn from it if it was a good guy? About how Google can do better next time. Okay. So this is the inventing the future bit. This is the bit where I want to give you some concrete examples of what kinds of things we are talking about when we say that we feel that there's great value in this data for innovation. The first one that I want to talk about is machine translation. So Google has been, ever since I joined Google in 2003 and even before, Google has had a pretty significant number of computer scientists and research scientists working on the problem of machine translation. And in doing so, they have always been attempting to harness Google's core strengths in the service of this goal of machine translation, where Google's core strengths are this approach to taking an abundance of data and an abundance of computing cycles and seeing how powerful that technique can potentially be. And for machine translation, that abundance of data has included all of the information that has come from crawling the web, which is written in all of these different languages, and how people interact with all of those parts of the web through Google search in all of these different languages, and using all of that to learn in very purely statistical ways, to begin with, how to translate from one language to another. And this has been a very powerful technique throughout the years, and Google has consistently scored very high or won in research competitions for machine translation. And in about the past year, I would say, as a consumer of this, it has reached that threshold where it has really been sort of a breakthrough level of usable. I, now living and working in Europe, can go and read the front page of Der Spiegel through Google Translate, even though I have about 3 words of polite German to my name. And it's accessible to me, right? I mean, no one should be negotiating international treaties through Google Translate anytime soon, but as a consumer who just wants to see what's being said, who wants to understand those headlines and wants to understand those stories, it opens that door to me in a really amazing way. One of the things that's very powerful about this approach, you'll see that the list of languages available for translation there contains some very small languages like Catalan, languages that might be seen as endangered. And one of the strengths of this approach is that it gathers in those languages as well and can apply to them as well. One of the fragile dependencies of this approach is that for the very small languages, every bit of data that is available to Google systems becomes doubly precious because there isn't very much of it compared to how much language there is available for English. Some of you may have heard of flu trends, but let me touch on it briefly in the context of what I've been describing. Flu Trends was the brainchild of a number of Google engineers who had worked with Google's log data before in their jobs, and who had the insight that the Center for Disease Control in the United States had historical data about flu outbreaks by geographical area over time, and that Google had historical data about patterns of search queries, which patterns of search queries were being seen most in geographical area, as indicated by IP address, over those same periods of time. And they went to the CDC and they asked for permission to take the CDC's data back to Google and to run a giant correlation study of this data against the log data to see, with no preconceptions, whether there were particular patterns of search queries that had a strong correlation to flu outbreaks. And they got permission and they did this, and they found that indeed there were. And this led to the creation of this tool, Flu Trends, which is available to the CDC and available to anyone who wants to use it, and has now been expanded to some countries in Europe and to Mexico and outside the United States, which for the CDC means that they can get a highly accurate advance warning of where a flu outbreak appears to be occurring about 2 weeks faster than they would get that information through their normal means, because their normal means is that I feel sick and I go to the doctor, I go to the pharmacy, and some information is collected there and it filters its way back up through the sort of medical hierarchy and gets back to the CDC. And so to have that information 2 weeks earlier to the CDC as a decision maker who perhaps has to decide where to send the vaccines is extremely valuable, and they're very happy about this. We have been looking, our team has been looking to see and understand where this phenomenon generalizes. And it does appear to generalize to cases where there is an entity, an organization, a government body analogous to the CDC that is responsible for taking action based on information, tactical information. And there is a time lag for them to get that tactical information. And one of the first areas where this does seem to apply, to generalize, is certain kinds of economic data, such as unemployment. And this is something that we continue to actively look at. Our chief economist, Hal Varian, has dubbed this phenomenon predicting the present, because it doesn't predict the future, but it cuts out that lag time. It gives you the heads up of what appears to be happening right now, based on what people are searching for in this completely aggregated, not about the individual, but about the aggregated picture of what's going on in a particular area at a statistical level. So I hope those two things give you a better sense for what our sense of the potential of this data and some of the things that can be done with it is. How am I doing on? Can you keep going? Okay. Let me talk briefly about some of the things that we have proactively done and built for privacy in the last year. One of the first ones that I want to touch on is what we have done to bring transparency and control to interest-based advertising. And I think this is an especially interesting example because if you remember my 3 boxes, the data that is involved in interest-based advertising is not account data. It's basically log data. So it's in the difficult box in terms of being able to show people what's there and allow them to edit it and allow them to do all of those things because there is the risk of showing this data to the wrong person and thereby, making things worse for privacy rather than better. But in this particular case, we have managed to find a creative solution, and I think that this is an interesting example for how we might tackle these things going forward. So just to make it a little bit clearer what I'm talking about, in interest-based advertising, we are talking about ads that the Google Content Network shows on third-party websites, such as news sites. Right? And so what's going on there is, suppose you go to the Irish Times website, and if they're showing Google ads, there's a piece of code in the website that you have just loaded that says to your browser, ask Google for an ad to show in the context of this web page. And so when your browser contacts Google and asks for an ad to show, 2 things happen. First of all, there's a log line of the fact that Google systems provided an ad to this browser in this context. And Google systems have to make a decision of what ad to show. Now, traditionally, the way Google's systems have made decisions about what ad to show on third-party websites was to make that decision based on the content of the website. So that if this website, for example, was a website about cooking, then Google systems would know that because they had crawled the website, and they would probably show an ad about cooking because if you're looking at a website about cooking, you're probably interested in cooking. On news sites, this can be especially challenging because suppose that you are reading a news article about a terrible murder. What kind of ad is appropriate for Google to decide to show you based on the fact that you're reading an article about a terrible murder? I actually have a particular, I think, very illustrative memory about this from a few years back at Google. I was sitting at my desk one day at work and, taking a little time off to look at the news as one does. And at that time, I think it was in Texas, a man had had some sort of mental break and had stolen a bulldozer and had gone on a rampage with this bulldozer. And I think no humans were actually hurt, but there was a great deal of property damage. So I was reading on this news site the story of this bulldozer rampage, and then I noticed that there was a Google ad next to it for used bulldozers. Now, the engineering part of me was a little bit thrilled with this. I was sort of, you can buy a used bulldozer? How intriguing. But clearly it was not, what we intended with the Google ad system. So I think you can see how this question on Google server side of what is a good ad to show right now becomes complicated in these circumstances. So what interest-based advertising does is to allow the system to use the fact that in the log lines, there's a memory that this cookie, this browser, was some time ago shown an ad on a cooking website, to say, okay, now on this news website next to the story about a murder, I know I showed an ad for this cookie on a cooking website before, so I'll do the safe thing and I'll show another ad that's about cooking. So that's what's going on with interest-based advertising with this stuff. Now the concern here, I think that many people would have, is that by default, if we don't do anything to fix this, all of this is very behind the scenes and mysterious for people, right? Web browsers are not designed in such a way that they make it very clear to people what servers their machine is talking to, aside from, that one main server that is shown in the URL bar. So how can we build something that makes this less mysterious? So the first piece of what we built was to, in these ads, put a special link over here, the Feedback Ads by Google link. And if someone clicks on that, then they are taken to information about what's going on and how it works, and to this Ads Preferences Manager page that we have built. Now, what this does is to show the user, based on the cookie on their browser, all of the interest categories that Google has associated with their cookie that advertisers are allowed to bid on. So here for this cookie, what's happening here is that an advertiser who comes to Google might say that I am willing as an advertiser to pay this much to have my ad shown to people who have an interest in sports basketball. And then Google systems, when they're in that circumstance, again, someone's looking at that article about a murder, and they're trying to say, okay, what ad should I show? If that cookie is associated with sports basketball, then that advertiser's bid will fire, and potentially that advertiser's ad will be shown because that's what they paid for. Now, what's happening here is that we were able to find, I think, what was most meaningful about this data for people and show it to them directly. So we're not showing them the actual log lines that led to these categories, because that would potentially be a privacy violation if we showed it to the wrong person. But we can show the categories, because the categories are boring. Right? I mean, they're not boring to an advertiser, but to all the rest of us, they don't contain anything sensitive. There's never a use of any category that would fall under the European definition of sensitive categories. There's never a use of any category that people would tend to find embarrassing. So if we accidentally show this to someone else who lives in the same house and is sharing the same computer, it's presumably not going to be a shock to anyone to see basketball, cooking, and gardening. And those categories are ultimately meaningful because that is what the advertisers are bidding on. So there's a direct, this is how you are being represented in these systems. There's a direct feeling of that for people. And so this page allows people to remove these categories, to edit them, to add new categories, to see the entire range of categories that would potentially be used. And it allows people to opt out. And since we have had this page up, it's been just about a year now, we've been able to see something very interesting, which is that out of the tens of thousands of people who visit this page every week, for every one person who visits this and chooses to opt out, 4 people instead edit the interest categories, and 10 people do nothing. Now this, granted, is a relatively, tens of thousands of people per week is a somewhat small set of people, but we would tend to assume, we don't know this to be true, but we would tend to assume that the people that visit this are probably the people who are already very interested in privacy. There's going to be a bias there, probably toward the people who have the privacy interest. And so given that, we find it extra interesting that only such a small percentage opt out and that so many actually edit their preferences. And I think part of what we conclude from that is that people feel very differently about this as a participatory experience, as something where they have control over their self-representation within the system, and they can say, no, I'm not like that, I'm like this. And I think we feel that this is very confirming of the value of doing this kind of thing, of trying to find innovative ways to move something that would have been behind the scenes and mysterious, but for no good reason, right, into a space where it's clearer to people what's happening, they can participate in it directly. just a few more, and then we'll move to question and answer. Another thing that we have worked on in our goal to bring transparency and control to this stuff is the Data Liberation Front, which is the slightly tongue-in-cheek named effort of a group of Google engineers to ensure that for all of the data that we have in that account box, again, because this is the straightforward relationship where there's a username and password and people log in, it is easy for people to take their data out of Google if they want to. So the goal there is to make sure that if people are continuing to have their data in Google services and use Google services, it's because they want to. It's not because it's too hard to leave. We feel that this is healthy for us and healthy for the industry, and that it will continue to push us to make sure that people are staying with us by choice. And then finally, the Google dashboard. This was our launched last fall, work that we did in recognition of the fact that even in the context of that Google account box, people were still having a sense that they didn't have an easy enough way to answer the question, what is all the information Google has about me? Because Google has a lot of different services. We've had a tendency to have a couple of engineers create something that might be fun and useful and put it up on Google Labs, and maybe people use it a few times, and some people never go back to it again, and they don't even remember that they used it. So what we did was to build a single place where people could go and see all of the services that were currently associated with their Google account, along with hopefully some useful summary information to even at this level sort of give them a feel for what that information was. And then down the right side with direct links to all of their options for managing that data, for deleting that service entirely from their account or going in and checking their settings, whatever it is that they need to do in order to feel comfortable and like this is under their control and they understand the entire scope of the data associated with their account. It doesn't show on this screenshot, but if we were to page down past the list of services, at the bottom there is a link that says, is this everything? And that link leads to a further explanation that really corresponds to those boxes that explains, as our best faith effort to explain that this is the account box and that there may be search data associated with the Pref cookie in the logs. There may be information associated with the ads cookie. For interest-based advertising, there are these other kinds of data, but it's not authenticated, so we can't show it directly, but here is what you would want to know about it in order to understand it and reason about it. So these are some of the things that we've done to continue to try to live up to those principles across this whole set of data that Google has. There's obviously plenty of continuing work for my team, but this is the path that we're setting out on and continuing to try to push forward on. And with that, let me very briefly talk about the Google Privacy Center and then wrap up. One of the things that we have, I think, come to terms with and addressed is that in our quest to make all of this not mysterious for people, to really achieve transparency, we will do the best if we sort of blanket the entire spectrum from show to tell in our effort to explain. So at the far end of the tell spectrum, you might see the traditional privacy policies, which serve a very important function, but necessarily are also legal documents. And even with our best faith efforts to make them as readable as possible, may not be the be-all and end-all of what people would want when they're looking for answers about their privacy questions. And so what we have attempted to do is to supplement that by answering those same questions, providing that same information in a variety of different ways. So at one end of the spectrum, you have the formal privacy policies, but then you also have FAQs that are structured differently and in a slightly different style of language. We, in some cases, might have comic strips. We have a lot of videos on YouTube. We have found those to be a very useful method of outreach. A lot of videos that we have made that have Google employees, Google spokespeople explaining particular aspects of privacy. And one of the things that we found very interesting about this is that people comment on Google, on YouTube videos. I mean, people don't usually comment directly on privacy policies, but people comment on these YouTube videos and they put, stars on them and they rank them and it becomes much more of a dialogue. We do have to acknowledge that the majority of the comments are not about privacy, but about the attractiveness of the person in the video. But at the same time, there are a set of them that are about privacy, that are engaging with the content, and we find that very useful and interesting to see. All right.
Thank you very much.